Hi class, tonight we're going to be talking about the topic of how we coordinate our landscape designs and our planting designs with natural events and cycles. And one that certainly comes to mind in our region is wildfire. So every fall we see a number of wildfires going. So there are ways that we can design to address that and other conditions that might affect either our plants or the landscape around us. So all environments are exposed to and dependent on a series of natural events, and those include things like sun exposure, wind exposure, precipitation, and regional events. In our case, wildfire is a big one. So as we're designing in response to climate, we should understand what areas are exposed to sun and what areas are in shade. So we tend to, in our region, south exposure receives that hot, direct sun, and that occurs even in winter, although it is usually a little bit more pleasant to be outside in winter. North exposure receives the least amount of sun, and so in properties where maybe north facing is a side yard, that area might not ever receive sun, and it can be kind of a microclimate where you have this moisture and mossy growth there. So different types of plants are going to grow in those different exposures. So in our region, we like to have some protection from the sun, and that's because we're in an arid climate and it's pretty hot outside, especially in summer. So that might be something to consider if you're designing and trying to create a comfortable outdoor use area. We might want to provide a tree for shade or an overhead or an awning. We can also use that to keep buildings cooler. So there's been studies that say interior temperatures can be 20 degrees Fahrenheit cooler than non-shaded buildings. Of course, we want to be careful using tree close to buildings in areas that are fire hazard areas. Wind patterns can affect our comfort in using the landscape space. So there's a desirable factor or degree range of where wind is desirable, and that's usually in the 70 to 80 degrees, so pretty comfortably warm weather, but not too warm. Once you get below 70 degrees, wind is not so desirable. It tends to make you chilly when you're outside. So in our region, wind comes from the south-southwest, and that can create an uncomfortable environment, especially for some of the canyon ridge lines. Those houses, you might want to put up a little wind break through shrubs or a wall to create a little bit more comfort out in the landscape. So here's some examples of vegetation screens, and you can see that in this case they're using a cluster of conifers to try and break up the wind and create a little protected area that's a little more comfortable to be outside. And there's some ranges of how much reduction in wind that you can expect depending on the plant height. So in arid regions, we can also plan for this breeze to move across things like open water or open lawn. And so an open lawn is actually producing a lot of evapotranspiration or plant sweat. So there's a lot of moisture in the air. And so when we have wind moving across that, it kind of creates a cooling breeze into the house or the outdoor use areas. And this technique was used a lot in the Middle East, kind of when you go back to Moorish designs. They would have these open water features, very hot, arid climate, and the wind coming across that as mirrored like water would evaporate the water and function almost like an air conditioning system. So it's interesting to compare our climate and our precipitation with Tucson, Arizona, because we receive about the same amount of rainfall as Tucson, but we have very different climates. Obviously, Tucson is hotter and drier. They're not subject to this wonderful coastal influence we have. Tucson also gets their rain twice a year. So in Arizona and places throughout the West, they get a significant portion of their rain in the summer, in the monsoon season. And that's one of the reasons water harvesting is done a lot more frequently, because they can actually refill those tanks 2 times a year, where we really can only refill them once. So just as an interesting note, the average family uses 400 gallons a day, and 50% of that is devoted to outdoor use. So to design climate appropriate in our region, we design with plants that are in sync with our water use cycle. We've talked a little bit about this. One of the terms that is called xeriscape. Ideally, this relies on natural precipitation only, but that's really difficult in our region. Again, because we're a Mediterranean climate, we get our rain over a very short period and then have long dry periods. So a lot of that vegetation has strategies for adaptation, and they go drought deciduous and they don't look so good. So we also want to maximize our irrigation efficiency and promote good plant growth. So we group plants by similar hydrozones. So we usually rank those as low, well, actually very low, low, moderate, and high. On the right is a couple examples of xerophytic landscapes. These do not have to look like rock and cactus. They can be quite colorful and lovely. So types of plants that are included with xeriscape include native plants, and a lot of times our natives, depending on the ecosystem that they're from, can not require supplemental water, or we don't have to add supplemental water. There's also adapted plants. Those are plants from similar Mediterranean climates. They usually sink in nicely with when our water arrives and have strategies to make it through long dry periods. One of the strategies would be succulent leaves, which store water during periods when water is not available. So another thing that we're very conscious of in our region and trying to undo a lot of urbanization impacts is controlling stormwater runoff. So in the old days, you can see the LA River in the top picture. The idea was to completely make a concrete channel, make everything impervious, and get it out to the ocean as fast as possible. So this has really disrupted our hydrologic cycle. And now we're really faced with how do we undo some of this massive urbanization that has created these impenetrable surfaces. So we are looking at ways to return our natural hydrology to get water infiltrating down into the ground. In San Diego, we don't have a lot of groundwater resources. LA certainly and Orange County certainly have much more, but there are opportunities for that, and there's always an opportunity to improve our water quality by trying to hold water on site. A lot of that is covered in Design 1 and Design 2, so stay tuned. So low impact development is really about doing just that. It's meant to reduce impermeable surfaces and retain stormwater on site. You can see some kind of strategies both in plan view and then a picture of a development where there's a stormwater infiltration feature as part of the landscape, and you really are seeing these all over town. Any commercial, multifamily residential, institutional projects, these are required. They're starting to be required at large residential, like large acre parcels. You're starting to see this requirement to include them too. So a little introduction to stormwater infiltration in the landscape as a feature if you're not familiar with it yet. Wildfire, this is a big event in our area. So We use our design techniques to create defensible space, and those can vary from each municipality in the region. If we are on a site that's located at the top of the slope, that is a very vulnerable position because fire moves easily uphill. So that density or the amount of fuel load is really important to manage related to wildfire. And the type of vegetation can be important. For example, our chaparral is it's a fire system that, or a vegetation type that is adapted to fire. So it's meant to actually burn every so often and revitalize the plant community and reduce thick growth. But now we've built among the chaparral, so it's hard to let it burn. So most municipalities have some regulations on how you are going to design if you are in a wildfire hazard zone. Those zones have been mapped out by the state, and each municipality usually keeps maps of those zones for their residents or people who, businesses in their community. In general, you have 2 zones, sometimes 3 zones. But zone 1, which is closest to the structure, usually includes irrigation and restrictions on plant type and how close plants may be placed to the structure. And then zone 2 doesn't necessarily have to be irrigated in most codes. Again, they vary from city to city, but does require thinning of plant material, whether it's native or horticultural, and never reducing down to bare mineral earth, which a lot of people think they're protecting from fire by doing that, but that is not a good strategy. Primarily because the invasive grasses move in, and then you have a very flashy fuel that actually exacerbates fire, and you can have slope slippage, which is another problem. So water storage is something to think about if you're asked to design a property that's out in a wildfire hazard area. Maybe they're on the edge of a forest. You can plan for that pool, if you're designing a pool, to function as an emergency water supply. And so guess what? Your clients would have the fire trucks on their site first and fighting the fire from that location if you go through the process of including the right equipment to convert that pool into a firefighting supply and register. So anyway, that's a quick overview of some of the natural conditions that exist in our region. I'm also going to post a lecture I did focusing specifically on wildfire for you guys. So enjoy.